Good afternoon, everyone. I am Bob Rapp, and I have the privilege to serve as moderator for this segment, this panel of our symposium that we have titled Potential Anti-Competitive Effects and Effects on Market Dynamics and Efficiency. It certainly almost goes without saying, as has been illustrated so far today by the presentations, the growth of passively managed portfolios and common ownership of index funds has generated a very, very lively debate about the impact on securities markets and corporate governance generally. And part of that debate focuses certainly on how concentration of ownership in index funds impacts competition among rival firms and their incentive to innovate, and when there is common ownership through index funds. We have an absolutely outstanding panel to address these issues and challenges in this segment. Briefly introduce them to you. Professor Florian Ederer is Associate Professor in Economics at the Yale School of Management, where he's also an affiliated member of the Department of Economics. Professor Ederer is also a research staff member of the Cowles Foundation for Research in Economics. He holds a doctorate in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Maria Genet is Associate Professor in the Financial Management Department of the ISE Business School of the University of Navarra in Barcelona. She holds a doctorate from the University of Barcelona. And the third esteemed member of our panel, Professor Joshua Mitz, is Associate Professor of Law and the Milton Handler Fellow at Columbia Law School, where he is also a member of the Center for Financial and Business Analytics at Columbia's Data Science Institute. Professor Mitz was awarded his Juris Doctor degree from the Yale Law School, and he holds a doctorate in finance and economics from the Columbia Business School. Keep in mind as we proceed to use the Q&A function if you want to address questions to any of our panelists. I've also invited them, as we have done so far today, to interact with each other with comments or questions they may have for their respective presentations. Now, we will begin our session with Professor Ederer, and his widely published research focuses on organizational economics, innovation, behavioral economics, and I think particularly significant for all of us today is very recent work focuses on the impact of common ownership, and today he's going to present an overview on theoretical analysis of the product market implications of horizontal shareholdings, or as we have commonly referred to them today, common ownership by large asset management companies. Florian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you very much to all panelists so far. I've learned a great deal. I particularly enjoy always this exchange between both economists and lawyers and law practitioners that I get from these conferences. Now, before I begin, let me give the usual disclaimer that I always give when talking about this topic and other antitrust topics on which I've worked on. I have no conflicts of interest. I have never worked as an expert witness or as a consultant in antitrust cases. I also am not affiliated with any research centers that receive funding from the financial services industry. And other than the index funds that I hold, I therefore have no conflict of interest. The work that I'm going to talk about is about common ownership. Our wonderful keynote speaker, Ed Rock, has already set the stage for what I will be talking about. This is joint work with Miguel Anton, Mireille Chinet, and Martin Schmalz. And usually I would give a bit of an overview of what common ownership is, but because we've had all these panels that already told you what essentially common ownership is, and this is a very sophisticated audience, I'll just skip over this and just leave you with this, now often repeated slide that shows how much of the largest airlines are owned by pretty much the same set of investors. Now, what is the impact of such common ownership or horizontal shareholdings, as Herb Hovenkamp and Fiona Scott Morton have called it? when large investors own shares in many firms within the same industries, those firms may now have reduced incentives to compete. So this would be anti-competitive effects. Basically, the way this works is that firms produce fewer units, raise prices, reduce investment, innovate less, limit entry. It has a long intellectual history. It goes all the way back to Julio Rothenberg's seminal work in the 1980s. But there has been a tremendous increase in common ownership over the past 3 decades, wonderfully chronicled by the work of Matt Backus, Chris Conlon, and Mike Sinkinson in recent issue of the AJ Micro. This is also one of the hottest topics in antitrust. Prominent law scholars claim, in fact, that common ownership has stimulated a major rethinking of antitrust enforcement. And this academic and policy interest is indeed driven by many market, industry, and macro level empirical studies. Some of these studies are listed here. It really is a plethora of empirical evidence, both on the relationship between incentive slopes, which I'll be more explicit about in a second, and Mireille Chinet will speak to the empirical part in more detail, but it also shows not just up in the positive relationship between common ownership and product market prices, which is going back to the famous airlines paper of Azar et al. It also shows up in positive relationship with regards to cost, negative relationship with regards to quantity output, negative relationship with regards to concentration, negative relationship with regards to entry, negative relationship with regards to investment. I've listed many of these papers here, but there are many, many, many more, including a special symposium of the AEA papers and proceedings, as well as a forthcoming issue of the antitrust bulletin. Now, this is a very controversial literature. In particular, the literature that is critical of these claims that I've just shown you is actually rife with retractions. And I think this is very important to point out because, you know, when people claim there are two sides of the debate, well, this one side of the debate has retracted many of its claims. So for example, Dennis et al. Previously claimed to overturn the results of the airline paper of Azar et al., but several papers actually disprove their claim to overturn, and Dennis et al. Have since retracted it in a recent version. Kennedy et al. Claimed to overturn the results of Azar et al. Too, in the sense that they claim to find no positive point estimates and do not reject positive effects. But actually what they do is they just do estimates based on a very selected subsample of the data. And when other researchers, such as Park and Seo in a recently published paper, do this with a larger data sample and use a more standard estimation procedure, it is very clear immediately that common ownership does indeed raise prices, just like the original Azar et al. Paper showed. Or, for example, there's a paper by Kwon that previously claimed to overturn the results of a paper by Anton et al. On compensation as a mechanism for common ownership. But in fact, that very same paper again has been retracted. So I'm not even mentioning several of these other studies funded and authored by ICI, the laboring group of the mutual fund industry, or BlackRock. But there's really not all that much to this two sides of the debate. It's pretty much just a one-sided debate. There are effects of common ownership. Still, the policy discourse on all this is heavily slanted. It's probably evidenced by the recent, or 2 years ago, the panels that we had at the FTC NYU Law School hearings, where actually, rather than academic and empirical papers and authors being discussed and being represented, most of the panelists that presented were people that had done no own empirics, had presented factually incorrect claims, or were industry affiliated or sponsored. Okay, now, those of you who know this common ownership literature, their number one question is always going to be, what is the mechanism? Because the investors don't run the firms. So even if the investors are common owners, well, they don't get to run the firms. BlackRock's Larry Fink doesn't phone up the managers and tells them, here's how you're supposed to price in on different airline routes. And of course, if we're relying on some argument that has dynamic effects, well, collusion or coordination really is illegal. And in fact, Noah Phillips, the FTC commissioner, very clearly states that why do we need a mechanism? Well, until we have a mechanism through which common ownership affects product market outcomes, and we're no longer disputing that the product market outcomes are there, but now we're looking for this mechanism. And that's exactly what this paper is about. So first, I'll talk a little bit about the theoretical framework. It's actually a very simple theoretical idea that just combines three ingredients from three different fields. You have a managerial incentive design problem, so there are going to be managers in our model. They're going to be pricing specialists. So that's the industrial organization part of this. And then there's going to be corporate finance aspect, which is that you have common owners or investors. Basic idea, and this is where kind of for those of you who are just interested in the mechanism, the main idea is that more common ownership leads to lower managerial incentives at the firm level. That leads to essentially managers slacking off, enjoying the quiet life. That leads to lower productivity at the firm level, which in turn leads to higher prices, lower quantity, and lower concentration at the product market level, as well as to even within firm variation across markets. Very much in line with all of these empirical studies that I previously showed you. So the mechanism that we propose is one that reconciles the seemingly conflicting evidence that is already out there. I'll skip over the model really. The basic idea is just that you have a principal agent problem. You have these agency conflicts already between owners and managers. Okay? The managers just improve how well the company is run, but the actual pricing, that is done by a totally different set of people. Again, it's pricing specialists. So it's not that investors have directly an influence of what airline prices are being set. The only way that investors can influence the way the company is run is through an incentive contract given to the manager. And a manager can't decide exactly which prices to set. So the CEO of United doesn't get to set the prices. Instead, the only thing that the CEO of United does is how well run the company is. For those of you who are not really all that interested in theory, now is a good time to check your emails. Okay? The basic reminder here is just that this model is totally standard. It has pricing specialists in there that really decide on the prices. It has a top manager in there that just decides how well and how hard do I work, how well run is my firm. And then finally, we have owners. This could be the largest owner, it could be a majority owner, it could be a coalition of owners. The model allows for all of these to essentially then say, okay, what is the incentive slope that I'm going to give the manager? How hard do I want my manager to work? Okay, everything here is super standard. It's just a combination of 3 different fields here. Now, what is the key intuition again? Let me repeat it. The main idea is that if you are an investor, you want your company to be run very efficiently. So therefore, you give strong incentives to the CEO. Therefore, when the CEO has strong incentives, he exerts a lot of effort. That's the EI here. Okay? That productivity improving effect has 3 effects. Again, totally standard. It increases the margin. The firm is more well run. It also has a price effect because the firm is more well run now. It expands its output, expands its market share. There's a 3rd effect, which is this competition effect, which is that as I expand output, as I lower prices of my one company, then that lowers the competitors' profits. Now, an undiversified owner, okay, one that doesn't care about profits of other firms, so the kappa ij that I have down here is 0, they only care about those first 2 effects. But a common owner, they care potentially about, to some extent, the profits of other firms in the industry. They're going to care about that 3rd effect. What is the upshot of that 3rd effect? The upshot of that 3rd effect is that those common owners, they do not want to set such strong incentives for the managers, because that would mean that the firm is then competing too aggressively in the product market. Okay, that's the basic intuition of the model. I'm now going to give you what the interpretation of this is. What happens here is that actually the common owners are excessively deferential towards managers. You can even call them lazy owners. They're super passive. They just sit back. Okay. Now, here, this is optimally chosen. This is very much in line with a trend that we observe over and over, that we would want to have more corporate governance. We would want corporate governance to be stronger because that would make firms run more efficiently. But here, these owners choose to be passive because it is in their interest to be passive. They sit back, they let the CEO just enjoy the quiet life. And that's why those companies are not so well run. And that's why they compete less aggressively. The model explains, therefore, why the common owners are passive. So the managers get to enjoy the quiet life. The common owners are passive. There is no intervention. There's no need to push for lower compensation contracts here by the common owners. Something that is perfectly sufficient is just to say, I'm not going to bother with anything here. I'm not going to intervene. I'm not going to pay these governance costs of intervening with managers. I'm just going to let them enjoy the quiet life, okay, which will then lead to softer competition. So to paraphrase John F. Kennedy, the only thing necessary for the triumph of anti-competitive common ownership is for good governance to do nothing. Okay? So really what we have here is a situation where passivity explains all of those results. Now, of course, you might be interested, okay, with this passivity, how can we get then variation across different firms in the same industry? Our model also accounts for that. So for example, we have an explanation for why Virgin America, before its merger with Alaska Airlines, why they competed so aggressively. Well, all you need to do is look at the ownership structure of Virgin America. It has large undiversified investors, Richard Branson, Cyrus Capital Partners, and Virgin Group Holdings Limited. Those people pushed for very, very strong incentives for their managers. What happens then? The managers really made the firm run very competitively. Okay? That wasn't really great for all these other airlines in the industry, but Richard Branson and Stephen Freidheim at Cyrus Capital Partners, they didn't care about this because they were only interested in the one firm that they care about, which was Virgin America. Very different, of course, to the ownership structure of all these other airlines that I showed you previously. So what can happen in this type of model is that you can have variation across firms, so maverick firms competing very aggressively, like this firm one here that I have in red, and then other firms that are more commonly owned, like firm 2 and 3, actually competing much less aggressively. Interestingly, what this can also then lead to is that you can get price effects that look like collusion, namely that the two commonly owned firms, when they compete against each other, they're going to actually compete even more softly than when they compete against the maverick. But that is not driven by any form of coordination or collusion. None of this is necessary, but it's actually just driven by endogenously determined costs, which are in turn influenced just by the managerial incentive contract. Okay, now that allows us now to reconcile all of this empirical evidence. So our theoretical model explains all of these empirical studies and proposes a very simple mechanism that says all of that is necessary to generate these anti-competitive effects of common ownership is passivity of large investors, which in turn translates into passivity or laziness of the managers, which in turn translates into anti-competitive behavior, i.e. soft competition in the product market. Now, let me reinforce here, and I think there's always a bit of confusion here. These theoretical results do not rely on owners using sophisticated market level incentives, or on top managers knowing the underlying ownership structure, or top managers making market specific strategic choices like pricing, or product market specialists knowing what the owners own in other firms, or what the top managers' preferred strategies are. None of this is necessary. It is totally robust to different informational assumptions. Now, that clarifies a fundamental misunderstanding in corporate governance literature. People have mentioned the arguments of Babchuk et al., okay, namely Scott Hurst and Lucien Babchuk, that have claimed that really these common owners, they don't have incentives which would lead them to limit intervention with portfolio companies, because it will be implausible to expect that the index fund managers would seek to facilitate significant anti-competitive behavior. Now, what we very clearly show is that it's passivity. You can be totally passive, okay, and you would still get anti-competitive effects of common ownership. So then it doesn't need to be any form of intervention of common owners. Passivity is enough. Or, for example, Rock and Rubenfeld claim that, well, while shareholders have a periodic non-binding vote on management compensation, this is too blunt an instrument to be plausible. Well, we show in our theoretical model and then later also with our empirical analysis that this is not too blunt an instrument. Management compensation is the only thing that's necessary to drive all of these anti-competitive effects. And it's certainly not true that the manager has to know what the owner's specific interests regarding specific competitive actions are, and they don't have to decide how much weight to give each owner's preferences in deciding what they do. All they need to do is respond to the very, very simple incentive contract given to them. Now, I will spare you some of these other details that are probably more interesting to a economics audience, so I'll just skip over them here. I think one important thing, though, to recognize is that what you have here is a principal agent problem between managers and shareholders. And that means that we cannot take it as given that the investors directly translate their own interest into corporate strategy. It has to be filtered first through managers. So I want to conclude here and just say that what this paper says is that managerial compensation is a very simple mechanism through which common ownership can affect product market outcomes. The mechanism does not rely on any implausible assumptions about what investors or managers do. The theoretical predictions can explain the empirical evidence that already exists on product market outcomes. And as Mireille Chinet will show you, the empirical evidence that we'll present also confirms the negative link between common ownership and managerial incentives. Okay, I'll leave the floor here now because I've gone on too long to Mireille Chinet and to the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian. That's fascinating. And I want to take a moment, if we can, to ask your colleagues on the panel, Mireille and Josh, do you have any thoughts or comments or particular question you might want to address to Florian at that point?
Not on my side. I will. I might discuss with him after I do my part.
I will take the chance and throw a question out to you, Florian, on the model. So did I understand correctly that your assumption is that common ownership increases what we often call agency costs, kind of broadly defined?
Only endogenously. Okay, so it's true that that is a result of the model. It's not that that is an assumption. Okay. It is endogenously arises that the agency conflict gets worse in some sense because the managers get lower incentive slopes. Okay, and so that in some sense magnifies the efficiency losses that you would always see in principal agent models.
So I asked this question because there's a new paper by my colleague Zohar Goshen and Doron Levitt at Penn, in which they make just the opposite argument. Their argument is that common ownership enhances governance because it reduces the collective action problem. And I'm trying to think if that's inconsistent with your model or consistent.
I think that's I think that is very much a story that is complementary to ours, which is there are many other effects of common ownership. One would be, for example, as you know, Doron has another very nice paper in the Review of Financial Studies together with Alex Edmonds, okay, that says maybe we learn something. There's learning by doing about governance, and holding several firms in the same portfolio allows me maybe to do better governance. Okay? So I view those stories as perfectly complementary to ours, because what really our key thing in our story is, and one that also the IO and the industrial organization literature has focused on, is one, what ours is specifically about product market competition. So all of this common ownership stories that exist otherwise, that are about collective action problems or that are about learning problems, they're not specific to any given industry. And all of that existing empirical evidence that has fueled this common ownership literature comes from like specific industry stuff. So it would have to be kind of explain those existing empirical trends to be conflicting or not with ours. But I don't view it as conflicting at all. I view it entirely as complementary.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh, for those additional insights. Let's bring on some more insight here, and I want to turn to Professor Chinet, who specializes in corporate governance, executive comp, mergers and acquisitions, and she's currently engaged in examining how common ownership by institutional investors impacts corporate decision-making by companies in their portfolios. And her research has been widely published, and today she is going to present for us a mechanism for connecting common ownership to product market outcomes. Maria.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to present in this great conference. I'm based at IES Business School, so this is in Barcelona. So good evening from Spain, late evening from Spain. So as Florian, one second, as Florian was mentioning, our theoretical framework provides some testable implications that I'm going to be talking about between the relationship between common ownership and top management incentives. So let me first provide some of the links between the theory and the empirics. So first of all, our theory considers that the totality of managerial incentives are what is here at stake, right? So when we talk about managerial incentives at large, we have to take into account all the channels. And here I would like to use Alex Edmonds and Dirk Genter's wording, in the sense that what they mention is that executive incentives must take into account the incentives provided by the changes in the value of executives' equity holdings. So what we are looking here is at the changes in these equity holdings, which would be the changes in executive wealth, rather than looking at year-on-year pay-to-performance sensitivity. Because if we focus only on these changes in salary, bonuses, and equity grants, we're just looking at a very partial way of incenting executives. And this part really dwarfs relative to the whole wealth performance sensitivity. So there are different measures of wealth performance sensitivity out there in the literature, and those are going to be connected to the type of CEO productivity that you model. Yeah? So if you model it as an additive function or a linear function or multiplicative, you're going to be able to choose between different measures of wealth performance sensitivity. In our measure, the CEO productivity is modeled multiplicative, and therefore we use the Edmonds, Gabet, and Landier. But conceptually, for those of you that have never thought about this wealth performance sensitivity, what those measures estimate is the change in CEO wealth for a percentage change in firm value. Yeah? And there are going to be small differences with regard if the CEO productivity is additive, linear, or multiplicative. The second element, the second connection between the theory and the empirics, is that the theory, as Florian was mentioning, uses profit weights. And the profit weights, this is going to be the weight that shareholders, for example, this would be as kappa, so kappa ij, right? This is going to be the weight that shareholders I put on firm J, yeah, on firms J's net profits, right? So this is a coefficient of sympathy, as we say, right? In the interest of other competitors' profits. This kappa can be then added, right? We can do a value weighted at the firm level, and it can be weighted by the stock market value weighting of all these competitors, or it can be equally weighted. Okay, so these are the two main connections: wealth performance sensitivity and kappas, that are driven from the theory onto the empirics. When we look into the data, so executive data will come from ExecuComp, and here, which covers all companies that are or were part of the S&P 1500 index. And the measures of wealth performance sensitivity, those come from Alex Edmonds directly. He was generous enough to share the code, and we updated it to cover these measures up to 2019. Then firms' information obviously comes from Compustat. And interestingly, for those of you that work on ownership, right, so we use the 13F data, but we augmented by scraping data from the SEC 13F filings directly because of known issues, especially from the 2000 onwards, known issues on stale information and omitted information on institutional owners. So that as well is an important addition as well. Our universe is from 92 to 2019. And this is our baseline specification. So on the left-hand side, we have wealth performance sensitivity, the different measures of wealth performance sensitivity, and how this is going to be affected by common ownership. As well, we will control for a vector of important controls. This specification closely follows Edmonds, Gabet, and Landier when they measure the effect of size on wealth performance sensitivity. And here we extend this model, which naturally follows our theory, adding the different measures of common ownership. Of course, this is panel, and these are, there are going to be correlations, but importantly, we're going to add here fixed effects. So we want to control for industry trends, those industry trends that are going to be correlated potentially with common ownership rising, let's say, and correlated as well with long-term trends in managerial incentives. So industry trends are going to be controlled, and as well, we're going to control for firm characteristics. Some omitted characteristics could be as well correlated with these two measures. So what we are hopefully capturing with this specification is within firm and within year variation, okay? And I'll show you a battery of robustness checks. Okay, so this is our main table. And essentially what we're doing is regressing wealth performance sensitivity on common ownership. And we have here kappas equally weighted and value weighted. Let's focus on column 1, right? So column 1 shows us a negative and very significant coefficient. And we observe as well that for column 2, when we take into account the value weighted measure of the kappas as well, we have a very similar coefficient and significant as well. This is both for industry definitions following CRISP, following CompuStat, and following as well the measures of Holberg-Phillips. To put these coefficients into perspective, so the first coefficient with respect to SIC CRISP, if a corporation moves from, if the corporation's kappa moves from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile, that shift means a 6% decrease in wealth performance sensitivity. Okay, and we're showing how this is very much in line with changes in 1 standard deviation from the volatility, which has been as well captured in the literature. Okay, so what we get from this initial table is that for the kappa measures that come directly from the theory, we have a very robust coefficient that is negative and statistically significant across different industry definitions of competitors. Next, I want to show you the effect for different measures of common ownership. The second column shows you the coefficient for the cosine similarity. So kappas can be decomposed in two, can be decomposed cosine similarity, really looking specifically at the correlations at the commonality of ownership. And we observe as well a negative and statistically significant coefficient. And the top 5 overlap, the third measure here, as well. This would be a very intuitive, if you wish, naive and detached from the theory, which just accounts for those top 5 owners that have as well stock in my main competitors. The last measures that I would like to point you out, these are the standard measures, the MHHI-D, value weighted and equally weighted. These are at the industry level, and we thought that were interesting as well to portray since have been extremely popular in this first wave of common ownership literature. All right, so overall, these tables show us that as well across these measures, these results are very robust. Next, I would like to show you for the main 3 measures of common ownership, the effect on the other 2 measures of wealth performance sensitivity, the Jensen and Murphy and the Hall and Lippmann, that capture slightly different variation in wealth performance sensitivity. And as you can see as well, we see negative coefficient and statistically significant. And finally, the question is this only happening for the CEOs, or is this as well affecting top executives? And as you know, ExecuComp provides information on the top 5, at least the top 5 executives. When we include this much larger set of executives, again, very robust, negative and statistically significant effect of common ownership on wealth performance sensitivity. Good. So summary of these panel regression results, there's clearly a negative relationship between common ownership and managerial incentives across very different dimensions and robustness checks. And if we have to think about the economic magnitude, if we think of kappas moving from the 25th to the 75th percentile, this is associated with a decrease in the CEO wealth performance sensitivity of 6%. And this is quite similar to estimated effects in the literature with regards to firm volatility. So it's really much on a par. It seems to be a reasonable effect. But of course, you are all probably thinking, well, but can you just give us a more of a causal estimate here, right? Because yes, our theory assumes that there is exogenous ownership, right? But when we go into the data, this is not realistic. So it could be the case that there are changes in the firm's product market strategies that could drive both changes in common ownership and changes in the structure of executive compensation. So how do we deal with that? How do we go one step further? And here we use a quasi-experiment, we would say, where we use additions to the S&P 500 of industry competitors. And we think that this could be potentially a good exogenous shock. And let me tell you precisely how this works. This is presented by Boller and Scott Morton in a very recent paper. So essentially, imagine that you have an industry with three firms, A, B, and C. Two of them, A and B, are already in the S&P 500. Now, corporation C is added to the index, and therefore index funds that already own shares in A and B will be forced to buy shares C as well. So our treated firms, those firms that we are looking at, are both A and B. Those are already in the index, and therefore they experience an increase in common ownership. Precisely because they are already in the index, the addition of a competitor to the index, it's not going to change monitoring to them. It's not going to change attention to them, right? What we claim here, I'm going to show you in the data is, well, if now index funds have to acquire shares in C, in the competitor, that naturally will lead to more common ownership within that industry. So we believe that this is not a problematic shock like the standard index additions, where there could be selection, or mergers of institutional investors, or even index reconstitutions, yeah, right? Moving from the Russell 3000 to other indices, for example. Okay, so let me show you, the classic first stage here. So what do these graphs show us? So look at the blue line. This is the distribution of kappas on the left-hand side, or the distribution of the cosine similarity on the right-hand side, before the inclusion, blue line, after the inclusion, the red line, and you see clearly that there is a shift to the right? So there is slightly more common ownership, more overlap after the inclusion. For CRISP, let me show you now the graphs for defining competitors through CompuStat. And let me show you now for Holberg and Phillips for robustness, right? So clearly across these different definitions of industry, there is this shift. This is the first stage. Second stage, well, the classic diff in diff specification. And what we observe here is that the treat times post. So here we are comparing treated firms, those that are already in the index, right, to controls. Those firms, treated are firms that are already in the index that experience an inclusion, yeah, versus firms that are in the index but do not experience an inclusion, times post. Okay, good. So as you can see here, these coefficients are negative and very statistically significant. Yeah. We use in this specification firm fixed effects and year fixed effects, and from column 2, 4, and 6, note that we add even inclusion fixed effects to this comparison between treatment and control, pre and post inclusion. And let me finish with some graphs that will give us very straightforward intuition of what's going on here. So what I'm showing you here, I'm plotting the coefficients of this estimation, right, of the diff in diff before. So from here, so here we see before inclusion and then after inclusion. So what we observe, there are two things that come out from these graphs. First is that before inclusion, these coefficients tend to be very similar to 0. And after inclusion, the effect is gradual. Yeah? It's not immediate, it's gradual. Okay, so this is for industry definition CRISP. We have a very similar graph for industry definition CompuStat. Before it's not distinguishable from zero, and then the coefficient starts to be slowly distinguishable from zero and negative. And finally, going through the Holberg-Phillips definition again. All right, so summary of the definitive results. Again, a negative relationship between common ownership and managerial incentives. The index addition of competitors leads to a reduction of the CEO wealth performance sensitivity at index incumbents, and the effect is between 10 and 16%, depending on the industry definition. So it's slightly larger than, a little bit larger than our panel estimates. And the negative effect is not present before inclusion, that's important, and increases in magnitude afterwards. So let me conclude and reiterate some of the conclusions that Florian mentioned about the goal of this paper. So the goal of this paper is to present one possible mechanism among many mechanisms that would be out there, right? A simple mechanism which, through which common ownership can affect product market outcomes. This mechanism does not rely on implausible assumptions of what investors or managers do. On the contrary, assumptions are extremely simple and straightforward from canonical theory. The theory predictions can explain existing empirical evidence on product market outcomes. And finally, our empirical evidence, and I hope I've been able to show you clearly, confirm this negative link between common ownership and managerial incentives. So let me pause here and open to questions and debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Florian, do you have any follow-up comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's something that Josh raised with this previous question already is, you know, and I think it's also highlighted here in our conclusions, is that what this paper does not say is how much negative effects is there, or how big are these negative effects of common ownership relative to the positive effects of common ownership. So I would probably ask, I know, Mireia, maybe to whether she can take a stance of saying, what is kind of where do we land overall on welfare effects?
Overall on welfare effects, I think that, you know, what we are showing in our paper is something that is very specific, right? And I think that there is this tension between being specific and trying to be as precise as possible, right? So what we show is this negative effect negative effect in terms of incentives. However, this paper doesn't say anything in terms of the potential benefits that this diversification may have in other spaces. So I think that in this sense, right, when we say this paper does not say that common ownership is necessarily welfare reducing, there are other potential channels working in parallel or other effects. We are trying to make here a very specific point on a simple and plausible mechanism.
Thanks so much again. Let's turn now to round out the panel presentations with Professor Josh Mitz, who uses advanced data science for research on corporate and securities law. And his primary focus is on information disclosure and capital markets and consumer financial protection and related topics in law and finance, including in particular short selling. Now, Professor Mitz has extensively researched and is going to discuss for us today the role of short sellers in corporate governance, and particularly the relationship between short sellers and passive index fund investors. Josh?
Okay, thank you. It's great to see everyone. I wanted to give a roadmap for this project, which is really a multi-part project in that it really focuses on three big themes. The first, which I'll talk about maybe at greater length today, is an idea that we should think about short selling in the capital markets as more than just a type of trade that one can engage in on the stock market, but as really a form of delegated stewardship or delegated monitoring, which has the capacity to reduce agency costs and create value for well-diversified passive index funds in particular. A second part of the project looks at how the rates that large institutional index funds charge to lend their shares to short sellers are in fact de facto sensitive to negative information that is out there about firms which might be the target of short seller campaigns. And because short sellers have to pay in order to borrow shares from large passive institutions in order to open a short position, this necessarily implies that passive investors share de facto in the price decline to some extent. And the question that we should be thinking about is how much and what's the nature of that profit sharing. Finally, the third point is that passive investors with market power end up actually, I find, constricting supply and raising share lending rates in order to maximize their profits. This is, I think, important in light of our discussion in this panel of common ownership. This is really not so much technically, I think, a product of common ownership as it is a product of concentrated ownership. But since the two inevitably go hand in hand in today's markets, I think this is an important aspect that we should be thinking about. So I want to start by conceptualizing the role of exit in corporate governance as it was traditionally conceived of. So a great paper on this is by Alex Edmonds in 2009, and really one can go back to my colleague Jack Coffey's work in 1991, which sets out the following simple story. Suppose a shareholder observes some kind of negative signal about the value of the firm. Well, we've been spending a lot of time today talking about voice, about ways in which shareholders might try to change things at a company to increase its value or reduce the private benefits of control. An alternative is to just sell their shares. And the point that, that's made in this literature is that the very act of selling shares by existing shareholders will put downward pressure on the share price. That downward pressure will in turn discipline underperforming management, inducing, for example, a hostile takeover or activism or some other form of governance intervention. And the key idea here is that in the classical paradigm, selling one's shares is in effect an informationally sensitive event. It has to be informationally sensitive. And by that, I mean, you know, the information that the shareholder has is not yet in the stock price, because otherwise the exit would not have the effect of disciplining. It wouldn't do anything to the price if the price had already fallen. So at the core of exit models is the acquisition of information, negative information, and the transmission of that information to the market by selling one stock. Now, a point that Jill Fish and co-authors have made in their 2019 paper is that the rise of index investing precludes ordinary exit. It precludes ordinary exit for the very reason, the simple reason, that large institutional investors who pursue an index investing strategy are by definition not trading on firm-specific information and have no incentive to monitor individual portfolio firms. That's long been understood as a consequence of diversification and the passive strategy. The claim in my project here is that despite these inherent limitations on exit in the passive investing context, passive investors can nonetheless delegate the monitoring that would have occurred, this sort of exit-driven monitoring, to short sellers. What are short sellers? Well, short sellers are financial market participants who sell stock first by borrowing shares, and then they go ahead and repurchase those shares, hopefully some point in the future after the price has fallen. Because a necessary predicate, especially under Reg Show, is that short sellers have located shares to borrow and sold shares that they have borrowed before subsequently repurchasing those shares. It thus follows that share lending is the means, the mechanism by which this sort of institutional delegation occurs. That is to say, the very fact of borrowing shares to sell means that passive investors who are lending their shares to short sellers are in effect a critical component in the mechanism by which short selling can happen in the markets. Now, one might ask yourself, why is it that an index fund who has a large diversified portfolio would even be willing to put their shares up for borrow? Or another way to put this is, why would they care about short selling in their portfolio as a whole? I mean, for one, they may want to just collect the lending fees, but as we'll see shortly, the lending fees from securities lending are really quite small. So there's actually not a powerful rationale most of the time for collecting a lot of revenues via lending fees. But one, when viewed through this exit lens, one can see that the reason why passive investors might want to, in effect, contract and profit share with short sellers is that short selling can be beneficial to a diversified portfolio. My colleague Jeff Gordon refers to these kinds of benefits, agency cost reduction and other portfolio-wide benefits, to actions that affect the value of a single security. He refers to those as governance externalities. And so a central part of the theoretical claim here is that short selling can be beneficial for a portfolio because it enhances the value of a portfolio. Short selling a single stock can impose positive externalities on a portfolio as a whole. That is to say, we should think about short selling not just as a trading strategy, but as a way to enhance the fundamental value of a portfolio by deterring fraud, mismanagement, or otherwise enhancing the stewardship of companies across a portfolio as a whole. And for a recent example of this, you can look no further than the famed case of Nikola, which involved a short seller who pointed out that this company had arguably fabricated a truck rolling down a highway, a truck moving along a highway when it was actually on an angle and rolling down the highway. This was their manufacturer of electric truck. And the big claim in this research report by the short seller was that this is a sort of a fraud in a sense. This was, as the short seller claimed, that the truck was not actually moving, but rather had been positioned on a hill. And I should at this juncture say that my hands are far less clean than Florian's. I regularly serve as an expert witness and a consultant and advisor and testify in cases involving short sellers and market manipulation. You can read on my CV for that disclosure if you'd like to see more. I'm also an advisor to the Department of Justice, more generally in areas of manipulation and securities fraud. So I come at this from having seen these issues on all sides. And this is a pretty powerful claim, right? This is a claim which says, look, this company is a fraud. And in fact, that allegation led to the founder of Nikola resigning from the company amid these allegations that, among others, that the commercial and so forth had been faked, but there were a series of other problems which sort of followed in the wake, including an announcement of government investigations of Nikola. So one can see this sort of action, this sort of short selling campaign as a kind of value enhancing operation in the capital markets, by which I mean other firms who might be in the position of Nikola are going to be deterred lest they become the next target. And so really the claim is that short selling can be a kind of delegated stewardship, a kind of delegated monitoring, whereby short sellers can hold companies accountable on an individual firm by firm basis by selling stock, by driving the price down when those companies are failing to take actions that would maximize the value of the portfolio, like not engaging in agency costs or fraud and manipulation. The key question when one thinks about short selling through this paradigm is how to align incentives between shareholders and short sellers. After all, short sellers profit when share prices go down. Diversified shareholders profit when a declining share price for a single firm increases portfolio value as a whole. Of course, the shareholders of a firm whose price is declining, their interests are diametrically opposed to the short seller in that case. But again, here we're thinking about the portfolio as a whole. The question is, if short seller profits are larger, when they have more damaging information, if you will, better information, stronger information about a single stock, when does that imply that the value of a portfolio is going to be higher? And it seems that the contracting problem that we have here, what we really like to do is to align the incentives of a short seller in a single case with those of the portfolio as a whole. That is to say, we want short sellers to have the strongest incentive to go after a single company like in Nikola, when doing so would be most likely to deter fraud, manipulation, or otherwise, or promote other goals that investors have, even, for example, ESG goals more generally across a portfolio as a whole. In effect, this is a contracting problem, and one that is made particularly difficult by the opaque nature of share lending markets. And I'll say a little bit about that. Securities lending is a very unique kind of market, and that it involves a number of legal loopholes and exceptions. And for the lawyers in the audience who worked in this area, you know that it begins with Rule 17F2C to the 1940 Act, which allows mutual funds to lend shares so long as the shares are collateralized to the extent of their full market value. This has led to a practice of volume versus value lending, in which some large institutions will lend a lot of shares at a very low lending fee and collect money on volume. And most of their returns are actually generated by reinvesting the cash collateral that they receive from short sellers, from their brokers. Another much smaller segment of the market that I'm really interested in is the value lending segment of the market, which is really, I think here, Vanguard would be the most well-known. Value lending seeks to capture a scarcity premium by lending hard-to-borrow securities or specials. These provide lenders with a high return per dollar of securities, though with fewer opportunities. So it's a small volume, high return, high rate situation. In effect, value lending is employed in situations where a short seller is willing to pay a high price for the opportunity to borrow a security. And that means that value lending programs are likely to be the situations where there's negative information about the firm. One can see that simply by thinking about the willingness of a short seller to pay a high lending fee. They're more likely to pay a higher lending fee when they expect to make more money from the short position. The key, I think, point to realize here is that what my research finds is that passive exit, this sort of delegation to short sellers, is informationally sensitive, just like ordinary exit. And what that means is that while index funds and ETFs cannot sell shares directly, they enjoy, in fact, de facto higher rates when lending to short sellers. That is to say, simply by operation of supply and demand, there's greater demand to borrow stock, and thus share lending rates on average will increase when there is negative information. Thus, that implies that share lenders and short sellers are de facto profit sharing. Now, the magnitude of this profit sharing is an open question, as is the microstructure, if you will, of this market. How exactly does it come about that passive investors, lenders like your BlackRocks and Vanguards and State, particularly Vanguard in this case, can in fact participate in this market in such a way that they maximize their returns? And that's really brings me to the sort of last 2 points that I touched on at the outset, which is the question of whether this is a demand side or a supply side story or both. What do I mean by that? Well, the demand side baseline story here is just that passive investors share in the surplus from shorting just by lending their shares. Increased demand drives up the rates, and therefore there's de facto profit sharing. This is true even if passive investors have no information themselves. One could imagine that this could be visualized as the arrival of negative information makes share lending rates go up. This is what we see in the data, and I'm not going to get into the data for the time, but I have an empirical paper which illustrates this. I think the open question, I'll wrap up shortly here, is whether there's a supply side story. The supply side story would say, look, from the standpoint of a securities lender, profit sharing is likely to be maximized when they both have negative information about the firm and there's sufficient market power such that a share lender can price discriminate against borrowers. What I mean by price discriminate in this setting is that if a securities lender is informed, they can adjust the lending rate in theory based on the value of the information that they have, exploiting the fact that they may be a monopolist. It turns out that in a great many cases, Vanguard is in fact such a large owner of the shares of an issuer that they in effect likely possess market power. And this is often driven by the need of short sellers to acquire a large block of shares from a single owner. This is in fact an implication of concentrated ownership. It thus follows that raising prices can serve two functions. One, to maximize lender revenue, and two, raising prices could be a way of screening for more informative short sellers. Of course, this takes us back to the question at the outset, are more informed short sellers also better at generating value for a portfolio as a whole? That's an open question that I haven't yet come to a view on. There's an empirical study, which I'm not going to spend much time on because we're short on time, but I'll just say that what I end up doing in this paper is look at information flows between the active and passive side of a fund family. Turns out that there's no barrier on sharing information between the active funds that are affiliated with, that belong to a fund family, which is also lending its shares like a Vanguard. And it turns out that even when you have externally managed funds like the Vanguard Wellington Fund, in the case of Vanguard, there is in fact a explicit disclosure which allows daily ongoing transmission of portfolio decisions to the passive side, really to all of Vanguard as a whole. And I've spoke with some insiders at these funds families who've said to me that share lending desks are in fact like trading operations seeking to use every bit of information that they can to maximize revenues. For the sake of time, I won't get into the empirics so much, but what in fact we see in the data is that when there's a change in the identity of an active management team, which I use as an exogenous shock to the transmissibility of information between the active and passive side of a fund family, that is followed by a change in the lending rate. So there does seem to be some supply side component, and the identification here is off of this supply side change. Last thing I'll say is that this does seem to be driven in the data by Vanguard, by the exploitation of negative information via value lending programs. And when you try to calculate what that profit sharing looks like, it ends up being on the order of between 62 to 87%, depending on which model you use. So it turns out that Vanguard is extracting, it seems, quite a bit of the surplus that short sellers would be making. This is consistent with their market power. It turns out that the price declines here are large enough that it's still worth it for short sellers to engage in these campaigns, even when they pay a high price. I'll stop here, and I would love to talk more in the Q&A.
Thanks, Josh. Mirjane has raised a question in regard to your presentation. She asks, and Mira, excuse me if I may do it, what determines lending rates and to which degree there is market power versus being competitive, and what's the evidence on whether they don't lend or recall the votes when an important vote is coming up?
I think the first part of the question refers to your last slides when you're showing the actual distribution of the surplus, right, between how much Vanguard manages to capture. But if you could explain, develop a little bit more of that empirical side, that would be excellent.
Sure. So just for the sake of time, I'll give a quick overview, and we can continue this after. What I basically do is say, if we get disclosure on a monthly basis of portfolio changes. So there's some limitations to how rapidly we can see portfolio changes, but the idea is to say, if you have a situation where by next month, a company has been removed from an active fund portfolio. That's a proxy for some negative information that arrived earlier. And then you can look back and say, all right, so I have daily share lending rates. How much did rates go up by? And if we take that as a fraction, or if we run a regression where we're just going to look for the average correlation between the increase in share lending rates that's attributable to some supply side change, and we compare that to like an abnormal return, how much did the stock price change? You can kind of get a rough estimate for the increase in lending rates, the share of the abnormal return that's sort of captured by the increase in lending rates, and it's spelled out more in detail in the paper. And I should say that the number you get is pretty high, but that's going to have really two components. It's going to have a supply side change that's going to be part of that. A part of that is just the demand side, that prices are going to go up when negative information arises. What I try to do in the paper is to separate those two out. But that overall fraction is going to have both components in it. Right. So in effect, this is the extraction that's happening de facto when viewed the rates against the stock price change.
Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, Florian. One of our panelists from earlier today, Cindy Alexander, has raised a question that I think is perhaps best directed to you. Cindy, would you come on and just directly pose that question for Florian? If you're there. There she is.
Yes, I'm here. Yes, I'm here. So this goes to linking up our panels, because there's a question of whether agency costs are going up or down in these portfolio companies. And I thought that something you said was pretty intriguing. So you're suggesting that the mechanism for going from common ownership to higher prices is lazy managers, which I think of as a slack problem. So my question is, who's getting the rents here? Because it looks like if there's slack in management, that means that we have pretty happy managers, but I'm not sure that we get benefit to shareholders.
Yeah, first of all, I think it's a great question that gets at the heart of the mechanism. Number one, I want to say is that it's not necessarily lazy managers. It can be lazy managers, okay? So it can be very much in line with this sort of enjoying the quiet life a la Bertrand Muller-Nathan, one of the most influential papers in corporate governance over the last 2 decades. Our model endogenously generates this. Now, Cindy correctly points out and says, well, if there's more managerial slack, okay, where do these rents go? In our model, actually, these rents, they don't go necessarily anywhere. There's just rent dissipation. Why? Because you're holding the top manager still to his outside option. So whether he's exerting a lot of effort or whether he's not exerting a lot of effort, in equilibrium, he always gets paid just his outside option. Now, of course, that's the contracting view, and there's now questions of like, maybe the right way to model stuff is the skimming view. Our model can also accommodate that. So the skimming view is that you let the managers just do whatever they want, and they extract enough rents by not working very hard and just getting very, very high base salaries with little performance sensitivity. One additional thing about the extraction of rents here that I would like to speak to is like there's also additional rent dissipation here. Where's this rent dissipation come from? Well, it's common owners. They give lower managerial incentives. Therefore, the firms are less productively run. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that those firms are actually less profitable. Why? Because you also get the benefit of weaker competition. So you get soft competition that is, and these gains that result in higher profits from softer competition are somewhat dissipated by less productively run firms. Now, the firms that really benefit from all of this are actually the maverick firms, the Virgin Americas and so on in the world, because they directly enjoy both the strong managerial incentives, a productive efficiency, while at the same time also benefiting from the weak competition or the less aggressive behavior of commonly owned firms.
Cindy, you're muted.
It seems very important because it gets to how you're closing off your model. And if it's slack the way we normally think of it in management. I know we had in other panels a discussion of other mechanisms for intervening, like hedge funds. So I can imagine someone who hears your presentation thinking they should go set up a fund and start picking off. And this is back to, you know, do you have is your equilibrium intervention proof? And maybe you want an intervention proofedness assumption here.
Well,
and we can, and that would be its own literature, right?
Yes.
Because if you're really in your equilibrium, because you closed it off, you don't really have an outside intervener as a possibility. If there's an outside intervener, then it becomes more important where the rents go.
Great question. And so our model, you know, sort of assumes that the ownership is exogenous. Okay. Now, of course, you could say, well, now what if we allowed activist investors to pick up those firms that are inefficiently run? Okay. Because we would just give the manager strong incentives. Now, it's actually not clear cut. Why? It's not clear cut because those firms also benefit from the weaker competition. Okay? And so if you allow, we're picking up those firms that were previously inefficiently run, and you make them run more efficiently, that also then leads to more intense competition.
Well, but they're chiseling on the coordinated agreement, so it should fall up.
Well,
I'm still thinking some student somewhere should have a fund.
I think the moderator is going to agree with that and exercise, unfortunately, some administrative authority here. Cindy, thank you for those insights and Florian and all the panelists. Fascinating presentation. We have come to, we spent our allotted time, and I'm sure that you can have lively conversation outside.